All right. So, in this session, we're going to talk about Genesis 4:1 to 5:32, which is fun. So, I am the host of the Thursday show, which Brad mentioned yesterday, and I've been going through Genesis. And I hit chapter 4 a couple weeks ago, and every week it's the same thing. I tell myself, okay, this is the week I'm going to finish chapter 4. And then I get a few verses in, and I'm like, okay, we're going to finish chapter 4 next week. There's so much stuff in this verse. And now I'm going to do 4:1 to 5:32 in about 40 minutes. I end at 5:20. Did I get that right? Okay. So we're going to zip through, man. There's all sorts of good stuff in this passage. Okay. So in the context, what just happened in Genesis? Adam and Eve sinned, right? God sent them out, put up a cherub to protect the tree of life, protect man from it. And so we enter a new world, if you will, a new dispensation. Previously, man was given no knowledge of good and evil. He was just given a command. Now, man does have the knowledge of good and evil. What's a fancy word for the knowledge of good and evil? Conscience. Yes, conscience. There in the back. We're going to see how this conscience dispensation ends. Spoiler alert, not very good. So the Pinocchio matter of government, just follow your heart. Let your conscience be your guide. Not going to work. Okay, so 4:1. Adam had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived, gave birth to Cain, and said, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord, according to the modern English version, which is a nice translation. It's pretty liberal. Literal, not liberal. We've been responding to liberalism, got my brains all scrambled up. It's very literal, uses the Textus Receptus, not a whole lot that does that. However, I think we can call into question this particular translation. I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. The help of does not occur in the text. Where it says, I have gotten a man, it says, I have gotten a man, and then the Lord. This word right here, et, can be translated as with, or it can be translated or it could be understood as a direct object marker, okay, which is a grammatical term, just let you know that the Lord would be the one that is being begotten. So if we translate it like that, instead of with as a direct object marker, what it would be saying is, I have gotten a man, the Lord. This is an interesting interpretation. What does it imply? Well, we saw whenever Adam and Eve sinned that God came and told Eve that she's going to have a seed that will stomp the serpent's head. I think it's quite possible that Eve understood that this coming seed would be God himself, right? Now here we are in the year 2023 looking back, and we've got all the benefit of the New Testament and the rest of the Old Testament. We understand that that was Jesus Christ. It could be, though, that Eve thought that her first son here, Cain, was this serpent crusher, and that she named him, I have gotten a man, the Lord, the God-man, right? Alternatively, that's not what she was thinking. Moving along. Then she gave birth again to his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of the flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had respect for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he did not have respect. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So we see early on here that God is demanding blood sacrifices for the covering of sin. For the removal of sin, are they removing their sin? No. Covering sin, restoring fellowship with God. This is something that is very graphic here, that God is able to just walk up and confront Cain and Abel. There's a thought that God would stand right there in front of the altar whenever the offering was being made. In this early history of humanity, that would have been possible. Now, with time, humanity grows, more numbers. That's probably not how it went throughout the whole dispensation. But we see a much more relational aspect between God and man in this dispensation than we do in later dispensations. So, God is not accepting Cain's non-blood sacrifice. Isn't it interesting, speaking of liberalism, what is Cain doing? He's creating his own way to pave a path toward God, right? God has set a way. Abel knows the way. I'm assuming Abel doesn't just sort of show up on the scene. He's born and says, you know what I'm going to do? I just thought up a good idea. I'm going to take that lamb over and I'm going to cut him open, rip the fat off his kidneys, and say, here you go, God. That would be an odd thing to come up with on your own, right? So it's more likely that God probably told Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, this is what you are to do. Here's how you are to do a blood sacrifice. Which was the first blood sacrifice, by the way? When God provided skin coverings for Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve did the same Cain move. They tried to cover themselves using vegetation. No, it takes blood. Now, in the greater context of Genesis, Moses is writing the history for Israel. He's writing the entire Torah, so he's going to give instructions later for blood sacrifices. So he doesn't need to get into that now. Okay. All right, so Cain is very angry because he wants God's approval. He wants God to recognize his religion, which is kind of a green religion, right? Okay, moving along. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? Is this because God doesn't know? No, right? God is asking several questions throughout these early chapters of Genesis, and this doesn't at all contradict his omnipotence and his omniscience. He does hold trials on occasion, as we saw in the last chapter. He poses rhetorical questions, trying to get Cain to think here. He's trying to encourage Cain to take the right path. If you do well, shall you not be accepted? Cain was fully capable of doing the right thing. Cain knew what to do. You are able to do this, Cain. It's not that you are, to use the Calvinist terminology, totally depraved and incapable of even seeking God, right? You know what to do. You can do it. But if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to dominate you, but you must rule over it. It's interesting, the terminology here with domination and ruling is similar to the same dominate and ruling terminology that we see with Adam and Eve after the fall. Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Okay, that escalated very quickly. And God said, okay, well, you win, Cain. You finally killed something. I'm okay with you now, right? Wrong. God does not want Cain to kill Abel. So they have a word. The Lord said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? Because God didn't know, right? God is limited in his knowledge. He can't know the future or the past. What is that, open theology that teaches this nonsense? Are you familiar with open theology? If you haven't read any open theologians, you are not missing much. It is a disaster. There are theologians trying to restrict the knowledge of God. No, God is not expressing that he doesn't know. He's holding a court. He's doing the same thing that he did earlier whenever he questioned the serpent and Eve and Adam, right? Actually, it's kind of the other way around, right? How did the court go? First he goes to the man who's in charge, then he went to the woman, then he went to the serpent. And then the curse went serpent, woman, man. Very interesting stuff, right? So Abel, he's got a good answer. Am I my brother's keeper? I don't know. Did that work? No. God knows. And so God said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. From now on, when you till the ground, it will not yield for you its best. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And Cain says, okay, that sounds fair, right? Wrong. Then Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. You have driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from your face I will be hidden. And I will be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. So the Lord said to him, therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one finding him would kill him. Okay, a lot going on there. Now, did you see embedded in this passage the structural racism that is embedded into Christianity and the justification for slavery and the mistreatment of different races? No? That's good, because that is not in the passage. However, just because it's not in the passage doesn't mean that theologians haven't tried to find ways to put it into the passage. Here are two documents from the 1800s. On the left, this is, what was the title of it? Sambo's Sermon. And on the right is a passage from a Latter-day Saint journal. Who are the Latter-day Saints? The Mormons, right? Mormonism, okay. The Mormons have tried to appeal to the mark of Cain, saying that man was originally created white. And then when Cain did this, God put a mark on him, giving him black skin, so as to set apart the black race as an evil race, which we are to oppress. And indeed, the Mormons wouldn't even evangelize in Africa for a long time, which kind of works out to be a good thing because they're heretical. But still, the mentality behind it is evil, evil, evil. They'll often say that it carried over to Ham. And I would challenge you to find a single heresy, and I do mean heresy with a capital H, that has done more harm to the North American continent than the curse of Ham, which is this nutty idea that somehow the black race is to be accursed. But it's not just the Mormons that are doing this. There were other whites that were trying to make the same accusations against the blacks. On the left is actually a sermon which takes the other perspective, that man was created black, and then whenever Cain did this, he was turned white, so now whites are the evil ones. No, 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 no. That's not the basis of race, okay? In reality, there's only one human race. We're all related to each other. We all go back to Adam. The varying skin tones has a beautiful story to it, and we're going to look at that. But there's not an ontological difference between those with dark skin, those with light skin, those with skin anywhere in between, okay? That is sinful man coming up with sinful doctrines in order to oppress each other. What then is the mark of Cain? I don't know. It doesn't say, right? Some have proposed that perhaps the mark of Cain was like a giant letter on him individually. As far as we can tell, though, from the context, it was only Cain who received this mark, and it was only Cain who would be avenged sevenfold if you were to kill him. So it's not at all to be a racial thing that carries on through the generations. All right, then it moves along. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. Was he able to hide from God? No, God is omnipresent, right? He's doing the same move that we see later in the life of Jonah. When Jonah tries to run away from God, run away from Nineveh, he hides down inside of a boat and ends up getting swallowed by a fish. Don't run from God. It's not going to work, guys. So Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. This word Nod, is the same word for vagabond that we just saw whenever God cursed him to be a vagabond, right? So it's like the land of the vagabond, east of Eden. Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. He built the city and called the name after the city after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael was the father of Methushael, and Methushael was the father of Lamech. Lamech took two wives. The name of the first one was Ada, and the name of the second one was Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in the tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who played the harp and the flute. Zillah gave birth to Tubal-Cain, a forger of every tool of bronze and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Now, that's a lot of names, and there's some really interesting stuff in there, but we're going to skip over that. And if you want to pull me aside and talk about cool name stuff afterwards, we can. But there are two things I want to talk about before we move forward. First of all, we see Cain settling in the land of Nod east of Eden, and he built a city there. Why is this significant? Well, what did we see in the last chapter? When was the last time the word east occurred in the Bible? It was after the curse, right? He drove the man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim, and a flaming sword was turned in every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. That's Genesis 3:24. Okay? So we have the tree. We have the cherubim, the angels who are protecting the tree. Where did Cain set up shop? East of that. So it's as if Cain is building a city, an encampment, and it's like he's lined up facing this tree of life. It's almost as if he is building an encampment to carry out a coup to try to get past those cherubim and to the tree of life. Cain is a rebellious dude. He's not a good guy. One other point to bring out here. Cain had relations with his wife. Now, there are some objections here that frequently come up. Where did Cain get his wife? From his sister, right? He married his sister, and people object. Oh, you yucky young earth creationist, you say that a man married his sister. Ew. First of all, the evolutionist is in a worse position than we are, because the evolutionist says that as man evolved, eventually the proto-man had to have sexual relationships with a non-human in order to have more human children. So while we are icky for believing in incest, they are even ickier, I think, in holding to bestiality. But that's beside the point. Evolutionism is a false idea. What then do we do with this incest? Well, there are a couple of objections, one being a moral objection to incest. The Bible says that incest is wrong. However, it was outlawed 2,500 years after Cain in Leviticus 18:11. God doesn't make anything retrospectively illegal. Just because he made it illegal later doesn't mean it was made illegal for Cain and Abel and Seth and Adam and Eve. They weren't brothers and sisters. But what about the biological objection? Some would say that we shouldn't have incest today because it causes mutations and biological problems. That's true. How does that work? So suppose we have a husband and a wife, and the husband has a particular genetic defect marked by the lowercase a. Whenever they have children, the genetic defect may be carried over so that they are carriers or not. This is simplifying genetics greatly. However, if we have a brother and sister couple that get married, then the likelihood of the genetic mutation coming to fruition in a way that is harmful is much more likely between close relatives than distant relatives. That kind of makes sense. Now, that's why we want to avoid incest, both with humans and even with dog breeding and animal breeding as well. If, however, we accept that this was much earlier in the history of humanity, if we reject evolutionism and understand Adam as a unique creation and Eve as a unique forming out of that, then I think we can probably conclude that early on in human history, there weren't a whole lot of genetic defects for us to worry about. So Adam and Eve would have had children with very good genetics as opposed to our genetics today. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. We frequently see the dropping off of ages with inbreeding. And it's interesting, we'll notice later on that as the human gene pool is restricted, these are the points where lifespans decrease. But earlier on, this was not a problem. Make sense? Now, just because genetic defects were not a problem back then doesn't mean that there was not genetic variation. Adam and Eve would have had the genetic code necessary to give birth to all of the humans that have ever been born since. Genetics can be compared to a giant switchboard where you switch a bunch of switches and you get a bunch of different variants as a result. So Adam and Eve, within one generation, they could have had children that looked like this, right? Or this, or this, or this, right? It's possible that if you walked up to Cain and Seth, you would have thought, there's no way these two guys are related because they look so different. Well, with time, as our genetic codes gets restricted, it gets to where we look a lot more like our parents than perhaps several generations ago did. Does that kind of make sense? We'll talk more about some of the scientific basis in some later sessions. Okay, moving along. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, and listen to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man who hurt me. If Cain will be avenged sevenfold, then truly Lamech 77-fold. Okay, is this a good guy or a bad guy? If this wasn't the Bible, if this was a spaghetti western, would he be wearing the white hat or the black hat? This is definitely the black hat guy, right? He's coming into town. He's bad news. Notice, this man is even more wicked than Cain, right? First of all, he is a polygamist. We can do a study on the names of his wives, and it seems as though, and this is certainly the opinion of several rabbi commentators, that one wife was for childbearing and one wife was for pleasure. He is violent. He killed a man for wounding him, right? He didn't kill a man for killing, right? He wounded him, whatever that may be, perhaps an insult, and he decided to take that man's life over it. What kind of a man? A young man. Now, whenever a young man dies today, it's unfortunate. We say, man, that guy was only 20 and he died in a car accident. He had 60 more years to go. Well, back then, men lived a lot longer, right? So killing a young man whenever you can live for several hundred years is depriving a man of even more life than it is today. What's more, he is very proud of it. He is boasting and bragging about his murderous ways. He's proud and putting himself above Cain by saying, well, he was avenged sevenfold. If you come after me, it'll be 77-fold. So we see then that the line of Cain, right, they set up camp near the Garden of Eden, east of it. They're becoming more and more and more wicked. And this is the tendency of humanity. And then Moses stops with Cain. It's as if he's given us this little portion to let us know this is the way that humans are going, right? That's only one man. It's quite possible that this is the normal experience throughout this entire dispensation, eventually leading up to the necessity of a global flood. It mentions briefly some technological developments that came out of this line, which probably got spread around in the pre-flood world, and then were carried over to the post-flood world. But we won't get into all that. So Adam had relations with his wife again, and she had another son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has granted me another offspring instead of Abel, because Cain killed him. To Seth also was born a son, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. So we have a combination here, right? Cain and his line become more and more and more and more corrupt. But every now and then we have a generation that comes up that's not necessarily as corrupt, that starts calling on the name of the Lord. You could even build an argument, perhaps, that some of the people from Cain's line were believers in God. Take, for example, the name Mehujael. It means struck by God, which implies God's judgment. Others would say that the name means God makes me live, which implies that there were believers in the land of Nod. That's possible, right? But overall, the tendency is toward corruption, as we see in the case of Lamech. Okay, so that was Genesis 4, and I managed to finish it in less than an hour. Woohoo! So, Genesis 5. Genesis 5 gives us several generations, several names, and several lifespans. It begins, "This is the book of the generations of Adam." What's the Hebrew word that's being thrown out here? Toledoth. Very good. Assuming that we're right about the Toledoth structure, the previous section would have recorded a family history tablet, if you will, and here it's giving us another family history tablet, which Moses is writing down into the Torah under the inspiration of God. So by the time we get it, it's the good stuff. It's inspired. It's entirely without error. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female. How many genders? 2. All right, very good with the math. I like this. He blessed them and called them mankind in the day when they were created. Adam lived 130 years and became the father of a son in his own likeness, after his own image, and called his name Seth. Notice, Adam's likeness and image is being carried along, right? Now, God created man in his likeness and image. It seems that the Adamic nature is continuing, and that this was the original design. However, the original design did not have Adam as fallen with a sinful nature that was being carried along. That is something that was added whenever Adam fell. Does that make sense? So we can derive here this concept of spiritual death, the concept of being in Adam, which Paul picks up on later. Okie dokie. Okie dokie. The days of Adam, after he became the father of Seth, were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Adam that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. This is a term we're going to hear a lot of in this chapter. And he died, and he died, and he died. Seth lived 105 years and became the father of Enosh. Seth lived after the birth of Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. Enosh lived 90 years and became the father of Kenan. Enosh lived after the birth of Kenan 815 years and had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. Kenan lived 70 years and became the father of Mahalalel. Kenan lived after the birth of Mahalalel 840 years and had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. Mahalalel lived 65 years and became the father of Jared. Mahalalel lived after the birth of Jared 830 years and had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he lived long and prospered, right? Wrong, and he died. Jared lived 162 years and became the father of Enoch. Jared lived after the birth of Enoch 800 years and had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah for 300 years and had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him. So it seems that Enoch did not die. So Enoch and Elijah are unique in that they did not die. They were taken up. Whenever we get to the book of Revelation, we see 2 prophets that will come who will die in the middle of the 7-year tribulation. There's a common thought that these 2 prophets are Enoch and Elijah, that they will come back for this ministry. However, it is possible that that's not right. Moving along. Methuselah lived 187 years and became the father of Lamech. Methuselah lived after the birth of Lamech 782 years and had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. Now, when we do the math with Methuselah, it seems as though his timeline is lining up to where he could have died in the flood. It's also possible that Methuselah knew his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers, right? This is something that can be difficult to wrap our minds around about the pre-flood world, how many generations there were, right? It is very likely that Adam knew people who died in the flood, because that's how long people were living. Let's see. Did that work? Okay. Lamech, now this is a different Lamech from the one of Cain, right? A couple names are repeating. We see that today. My grandfather's name was Paul. Every now and then I come across another Paul. We're all over the place, right? Lamech lived 182 years and had a son. He named his son Noah, saying, "This one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord has cursed." Okay? So he names him Noah. Pop trivia. Does anyone know any Hebrew words from the same root as Noah? No? Okay. Oh, yes, please do, if you have the answer. One of them would be Naham, which is translated often as repent. It can often mean like to sigh, sort of like the sigh. Naham, that's not really how I sigh, but it could be how the Hebrew speakers sighed, right? It also is related to the idea of comfort, right? This one will comfort us. Okay, Lamech lived after the birth of Noah 595 years and had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. Noah was 500 years old and became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay, if we take a look at the possibilities here, people were living a really long time. It's also possible that people were having a lot of kids. It's not unreasonable to think that the average family had 20 kids. Today, if you have a family with 6 kids, we say, wow, that's great, man, a quiver full, right? I love seeing families that have a lot of kids. I think it's wonderful. 12 is the number of kids that Jacob had. A dozen kids is not uncommon even today. It's not the norm. But it's quite possible that back then they had even 20. And if we work with that number, that we're sort of increasing by a factor of 10 every generation, then the sum of the 8th to 11th generations could have worked out to be way up in the billions. It's quite possible that prior to the flood in the days of Noah, there were more people on earth than there are today. Okay, I mentioned the lifespans, okay? We just read the lifespans of people prior to the flood, and here's kind of the layout of the different generations. People were living for several centuries. If we look, right, these are the different generations. So we have Adam way up here, and Israel, Jacob way down here, okay? There are 2 points where we can see a significant drop-off in the lifespans. One is right here, which would be at the flood, and then another is right about here. See how it goes from being several hundred to about 100 after it drops off? Do you see those drop-off points? Okay. Some would say that after the flood, the environment became less desirable for man. I think there's an aspect to that which is true. But I also think it's possible that from the restricting of the genetic code at the flood and at the Tower of Babel, which we'll get to later, at those 2 points, our families are restricted significantly, and that through those 2 periods, we drop off in our lifespan. Why? Because of inbreeding, if you will, right? As we saw earlier, whenever we have close relatives being married and having children, we greatly increase the chances of having genetic defects, which could result in disabilities as well as shortened lifespans. So I think that whenever the 3 sons of Noah with their wives were preserved, eventually within a few generations, we had to have brothers and sisters marrying again, as well as cousins. And that probably led to a lot of genetic defects, many of which are probably still prevalent, since even today we're not living to be several hundred years old, but maybe 100 if we're lucky. And then that, once again, at the Tower of Babel, we receive another restriction whenever God confuses the languages and spreads people out. Okay, does that kind of make sense? Okay. Oh, at one point, before we close up, the Bible is not the only text talking about this, right? Assuming the Bible is right, that man was together at the Tower of Babel and then spread out, we would anticipate what? We would anticipate that pagans took a national memory of the time from before the Tower of Babel, from before the flood even, perverted that and turned it into false religions and propaganda, right? Well, it happens that we have a Sumerian king list in which we see a list of kings that had incredibly long lives, much longer than we see in the Bible. So we know it's a lie because the longest man's ever lived was that case with Methuselah. Clearly propaganda to blow up the Sumerian kings. But we see long lives and then a flood, and then we start to see a decay of the lifespans, which aligns with the actual historical course of events, only turned into pagan propaganda, which is precisely what we would anticipate if the Bible was true. Make sense? Okay, so that was 2 chapters of Genesis at warp speed. Okay, time for chow, right? Okay, great.
Thank you, Paul. Let's pray for the food real quick, and then I'll dismiss us to eat. Father, thank you so much for this conference. Thank you for these great men that you have equipped. So much to learn from them. Please continue to bless our learning, Lord, and our study of your word, and please bless the food that we eat to our bodies. Bless the hands that made it. For we ask all of these things in Christ's name, amen.